Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'll be sharing with you how I use my oracle decks. We'll chat about how I use them for affirmation, divine inspiration, self-care, mindfulness messages, and of course, as a complement to my tarot readings. So one of the ways that I use my oracle decks is how probably a lot of oracle decks are intended to be used, which is as an affirmation deck. So we're going to be taking a quick look at the Universe Has Your Back Oracle. So affirmation cards or oracle decks that are designed to read more like affirmation cards really are created to provide you with an affirming or a positive message to help you carry into your day or into your reading, depending on how you're using it. So for this particular deck, we can see here that a lot of the messages on the cards are very uplifting, very spiritual for this particular deck, but they aren't always that way. Here we have, I'm a spirit having a human experience. I have mentioned this deck before. I think is a little bit wordy because I think it's overwritten. I think that right there is perfect, but that's, just a personal nitpicky thing. I am unapologetic about what I desire, and I trust that what I focus on will grow. So you can see that these are very much affirmations that are really wonderful for intention setting. And that's kind of the way how I use an affirmation deck, is more as like an intention setting or an idea or energy that I want to really tap into for that day, or to add to a tarot reading depending on how I'm using it. So here we have, my vibes speak louder than my words. And so for me, how I personally use affirmation decks is really to take the message that's written on the cards. So for me, when I'm working with a deck for affirmation, it's really important the message that's on the card, the actual text that's there. I love beautiful artwork, and one of the reasons that this deck is still in my collection is because of its gorgeous artwork. Personally, I think a lot of the cards are overwritten in this deck, but I think the core messages are really spot on, and I really enjoy using them in my personal practice. So how I use an oracle deck for affirmation is to really take the message that's written on the card and to apply that to my day, to use that as sort of my intention for the day. I often include what's actually written on the cards in my journals. And a lot of times when we have something that's really wordy like this, I will only pick out key phrases. If the whole thing is just beautifully written, then I might include the whole thing. But if it's a lot of text, I usually just pick out the key phrase that really catches my eye. And for me in this card, it's see beyond the limits of fear. That's the key phrase that really speaks to me, that really calls to me in this whole grouping of words here. And so when I'm using an oracle deck to set an intention for the day, what I would do is just pull out that one phrase from this card. Oftentimes I will make color copies of my cards and put them in my journals. If you've seen some of my journal videos, you'll see that I do that. Again, here's another one that's great. I recognize that I have chosen fear and I choose again. This is an example of one that I think that the text just is overwritten, because I don't think it needs to say I choose love. I think just having this as an affirmation, I recognize that I have chosen fear and I choose again, is so powerful. And that's a wonderful sentiment to keep with you throughout the day, right? To look at all of the times when you are choosing fear and then make that conscious choice to choose again. And that's kind of how I use an affirmation deck, is really to take the whatever key phrase or caption that speaks to me on the cards. That's what I pull out. That's what I keep as my intention for the day. Sometimes I will kind of repeat it to myself as kind of like a mantra. So here we see obstacles or detours in the right direction. That's a great, like, simple little affirmation that I can keep with me throughout the day. Might want to put this card actually up at my desk so that I can remember that every time I come across an obstacle today, that's a chance for me to grow and to try something new. I often include them in my journals, as you will see, but when I'm working with an oracle deck strictly for an affirmation, for a daily affirmation, what I do is I shuffle, I pull a card, and then usually that card will sit up on my workspace or my altar space, depending on what I'm pulling it for. So I don't tend to use a lot of affirmation decks, and I don't have a ton of them in my collection. The ones that I have are very geared toward my particular, not only aesthetic, but my particular way that I see the world. And I really like for my oracle decks that I use as affirmation draws, as a daily intention to really reflect that. And so a lot of times that's why I will just pick out key phrases from certain cards. Or for example, this one, my outer experiences are a reflection of my internal condition. That's wonderful. It's really succinct. It's beautiful. It reflects the way I see the world. And for me, that makes a wonderful affirmation for me to just keep in mind throughout the day. So that's a look at how I might use an oracle deck to set an affirmation for the day. So another way that I might use an oracle deck separate from tarot would be to use it for divine inspiration. So here we have the Archangel Gabriel deck. I'm not a huge fan of Doreen Virtue decks. I do believe that this might be, I think I may have one other, but I have found that sometimes her decks work really well for this kind of divine inspiration draw. You can use any sort of oracle deck that might speak to the divine for you. I also like to really use the Goddess Oracle for this. I'm trying to spread out my deck so that you don't keep seeing the same ones every time as we go through this whole series this month. So I've tried to just sort of pick one for each category, but there are a ton of different decks that you could use for this. You could use any sort of deck that speaks of divine inspiration for you, that speaks of divine guidance. And how I use this, funny, divine guidance, the ideas you are receiving are heaven-sent answers to your prayers. Okay, that doesn't quite fall in line with how I see things and my personal view of the world, but I like the idea that we can use the oracle decks to kind of help us, in a sense, communicate with the divine realm. And that's kind of how I see it. I don't personally feel that like Archangel Gabriel is speaking to me through these cards. That's not really how I see the world, but I feel that I can draw one of these cards to kind of provide a message, a divine message from the universe, because I don't see it as this being or that individual. I see it more as like archetypes, which are a representation of the divine whole. And so again, that's just my personal interpretation that works for my personal practice. But how I like to use an oracle deck for divine inspiration is actually just to shuffle and draw a card and use that as a springboard for communication to the divine all. This is the message that the universe or the cosmos or the divine, however you see that, has for you in this moment. A lot of times I like to use tarot to expand on this message, but for right now I really just want to focus on the oracle decks themselves. And for this particular purpose, I do really like oracle decks where the artwork does sort of reflect that divine realm for me. So one of the things that I like about this deck is that it has kind of the Renaissance artwork. And I think that that's really wonderful. I also love like the Goddess Oracle, which we'll see here in an upcoming episode, and things that really tap into that sort of energy. But I really enjoy the artwork that speaks of the divine realm to me in that way. I also like, for my oracle decks that I use for divine inspiration, to have some sort of message. A keyword isn't necessarily as important when I'm looking at using an oracle deck for divine guidance, so to speak, or divine inspiration. Really what I'm looking for is the artwork and the little message on it. So it is important to me that they have a message, because I need something to sort of kickstart that idea. And then I kind of let that be the springboard for my message. For me, that's not the whole message. That's just the start of it. That's the root. And then I will either through my own journaling, so funny when the cards just work out this way, either through my own journaling, I'll write the message down and then I will expand upon that as in what comes to me from my inner self, or from, you know, whether that be divinely guided or from my own inner self. And I use that to sort of reflect on what I'm looking at and what I'm seeing in the card as well. And then I may bring in aspects of the imagery if that relates. If there are keywords, maybe I'll bring that into the message as well. But for me, this is really just about pulling one card and sitting with that message. And for the most part, really journaling about it, really thinking about what that message might mean for me in the moment and how I might be able to incorporate that into my day. So I think any deck that really has that sort of divine feel to you, that feels like it is the divine speaking to you, or the cosmos speaking to you, or your particular deity, if that is how, how your particular practice goes. I have certain decks that I use with certain deities as well. And for me, that's also a way to tap into that divine inspiration or that divine guidance through a deck. So that's another way that I use my oracle decks, is for divine inspiration or divine guidance. So one of my favorite ways to use my oracle decks is actually for self-care. So for me, in looking at using an oracle deck for self-care, the artwork does need to convey a sort of self-care feeling to me. It needs to feel nurturing and supportive. The keywords on the deck also need to feel nurturing and supportive. See, here we have relieve anxiety. Well, that's a huge one for a lot of people, myself included. Stop breaking agreements. Yep, that's important. Examine your integrity. This particular deck has a little bit different keywords, which is one of the reasons that I really like it. We will see some other decks that have a little bit more traditional, kind of more affirming messages for their keywords. But I like that these keywords are they're different and they're very to the point. So the keywords are important. The artwork is important. Love this. It's a no. Sometimes it's okay to say no, right? That's an important self-care message. It is okay to say no. So here's the It's a Yes card. One of the things that's really important about using a oracle deck for self-care readings for me, especially if I'm using it on its own without pairing it with the tarot, is the guidebook. So the guidebook in a self-care oracle can be really foundational and can be really important to your readings, especially if you're using it as a standalone. Now, there is nothing wrong with reading intuitively, and I do that a lot as well. But when you find a guidebook that has really wonderful messages that provide so much inspiration and actually provide you with sort of actionable steps, which is one of the things I really love about this particular deck, that can really help you to actually take that self-care message and put it into practice. It's one thing to just do a self-care reading and then to walk away and not really think about it again or not actually put it into practice. And so one of the things that I think is really important when you're looking at using an oracle for self-care is to consider whether you are going to use the guidebook and what that guidebook looks like. Now, I do have several oracle decks that I use for self-care that I don't use the guidebook because the guidebook itself doesn't necessarily help me any. But when I'm looking at using an oracle totally on its own, just like using it on the merit of its own strengths, the guidebook is really key for that. So one of the things that I really like about this guidebook is that we have not only a key phrase that you can tap into, we have an expansion of that. And then we also have, some information about the card. It has questions to ask yourself. There are always little questions in here that you can pull out as journaling prompts if you really want to expand on the message more. And one of the things that I really like is it has an action step. So it gives you a way to actually take that message and to put it into practice, which I really appreciate. And I think that's really important when you're looking at using a self-care oracle strictly on its own. Now, even if I were to pair this with tarot, I would still consult this guidebook because this is one of those guidebooks that the messages always have something really important to say, and there is always something within the text that I can pick out and really settle on it. That's my thing I need to focus on today. So while it may ask you, to look at this and to look at this, how I use it for self-care is what of those questions really stands out to me. There's always at least one. No matter what card I pull, there's always at least one question, one bit of text, one thought or idea within the guidebook that really just kind of clicks in my mind and goes, oh, that's the one. That's what I need to focus on. And so that's what I'll pull out. That's what I'll write in my journal. That's what I will journal about and expand on and think about in terms of the reading that I've done. And then when it has action steps, that's always great because then it allows us to actually take that message and actually do something with it, to actually put it into practice. So that's a look at how I might use an oracle deck for my self-care practice. So another way that I like to use oracle decks just on their own is to pull cards for a mindfulness message or for a meditation. So this seemed to be the perfect deck for that because it kind of combines both those things into one. So when I am pulling an oracle deck for a mindfulness message, similar to the affirmation draw, this is where I'm pulling a card to really just sit and take a minute and focus on the message that I'm getting. For this particular practice, I usually don't put it in my tarot journal because for me, this is more of an in-the-moment practice. This is when I need to take a break. I need to just kind of step away from everything and I need to have a moment of, I love when the cards just pop up correctly. I swear I didn't plan this. I just pulled it out of the box. But for me, when I need a moment of grounding, that's how I use a lot of my sort of mindfulness decks, is when I need to just take a moment and ground back into myself. I just love that that card comes up. So a lot of times how I will use this is just to shuffle the deck and to pull a card. Now, sometimes I don't actually shuffle the deck. Sometimes I will go through the deck and I will just look through the cards. And maybe I might have an image or a word that really speaks to me. So I'll pull that one out and I'll just keep working my way through the deck. I'm really looking at the cards, the imagery. I'm really looking at the messages. For me, in this particular practice, it's really wonderful to have a deck like this where there is beautiful artwork and only one word. This would be a lot more difficult to do. This particular practice would be a lot more difficult to do if you had a deck with a lot of words like the universe has your back. This wouldn't work very well for that. But so maybe I just go through here and I'm just pulling out a few cards that for whatever reason that caught my attention. Right, that caught my attention. And so I'll go through the deck, the whole deck, and I will choose cards that just call to me in the moment. And again, this is not something that I journal. This is just something that I do kind of to take a break, to ground back into myself and to have a moment of, look, stillness along my journey of transformation and choice. So I think that this is one of my favorite ways to actually use my oracle decks. And it's not one that we ever really see on my channel because it's not something I journal about. And it's not something that is an outward expression of my practice, right? It's something that I do in those quiet moments when I need to take a break from everything, when I need to step away and just kind of ground into myself. And so I intentionally, or really intuitively, pull out the messages that resonate with me for that moment. And then I will look at the cards that I drew and I will get my message from that. And again, you could totally journal about this. I just don't. And this is actually one of my favorite ways to work with my oracle cards. And this is actually my favorite deck to do that with because it works so beautifully for that particular practice. Being that the artwork is gorgeous, there's so much to sink into there, and the keyword really does kind of help stimulate my intuition, and it gives me something to really tap into and then to expand upon, again, just in my own mind, in my own body. Another way that I might use a mindfulness deck is to use it as this deck really does intend, which is for a meditation. So in that particular practice, I might shuffle and pull a card randomly, or I might, you know, select a card that's the idea or the theme that I want to meditate on. And I will just lay this card down here. And then I kind of like to sort of draw myself into the artwork and really just sit and meditate on that image that I'm seeing. I try not to think too much about it. I kind of just try to let it be with me. And this is very much a difficult practice. I will admit, meditation is hard. If you've ever done meditation, it's a hard practice. And I've been doing it for years, and there are days when I still struggle with it, and I'm just like, nope, it's not working today. And particularly in those days when I'm having difficulty with that, using a deck to help me provide a focal point for my meditations actually is quite helpful. And I use a couple of my oracle decks for that particular purpose, this, however, being my favorite. So that's how I might use an oracle deck, not only for meditation and for mindfulness messages, but actually to help me just kind of take a break and take a moment and a breather from the world itself. And of course, the last and probably most used way that I work with my oracle decks is in combination with tarot. Now, I'm actually not going to go into detail in this video about that because I actually am going to do a whole video on how I work with oracle and tarot together. But just to give you a quick idea, so in general, when I'm using a oracle deck along with tarot, I'm pairing my decks together to help me either focus in on my message, as we see here in this 3-card spread, which is one of my favorites and we will discuss more in detail. But it also works great to maybe help expand and help you to understand better your tarot deck. So what might we look for in the Knight of Cups? We might look for the harmony that the Knight of Cups brings. And what might we look for in the Queen of Pentacles? She might serve as a reminder to reflect on all that we have grown, all that we have accomplished, and how can we tie that back into our creativity. So you can see here that an oracle deck, particularly one that's really attuned to your tarot deck or that complements it really well, can be a wonderful way to help you expand and to sort of unlock the messages of tarot. So that is just a quick little rundown of how I might also use oracle and pair it with my tarot decks. As I mentioned before, I'll be expanding upon that practice in an upcoming video. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.